Gen Z scrolls for hours in the dark. As an advertiser, you would think that was a dream, this commitment to being constant audience members. It drives both spectator and influencer, but what it does not drive is culture. And culture creates consumerism. Our need to consume has become one of the most powerful drivers of creating culture. So the problem with Gen Z, we are too scared to actually want something for ourselves in fear of being judged for wanting the wrong thing. With Gen Z, and I have seen this firsthand, the true trick to success is really I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today I'm going to do something incredibly on brand and kick this episode off with a quote from one of my favorite books. So, just going to get straight into it. So, we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Now, if you're not a big nerd like me, you might not immediately recognize this as the last line that closes out The Great Gatsby, a novel which was written over 100 years ago and reviewed by probably thousands of high school students since. I think it's also the perfect intro to today's episode because we'll be closing off this little mini-series on different generations, how they're perceived, and how to best communicate with them. So today we'll be exploring Gen Z through one of the greatest novels of all time, The Great Gatsby. As an older Gen Z, only child, and sociology girly, I was very excited to record this episode. So excited that I went out, bought another copy of The Great Gatsby, and reread it in preparation for this episode. I traveled around with that book. I took it to a very remote island where I stayed for a week. I took it to coffee shops in the city, to the nail salon, to my therapist's office, and at some point I lost it, which was really annoying because I had added a bunch of little notes in the margins, highlighted lines that I thought were particularly useful for this episode to sort of support my thesis, and it just vanished into thin air. So if anybody out there finds an annotated copy of The Great Gatsby with pink Post-its and I think a yellow highlighter used, that was mine, and I would love it back. I was actually really cranky about that at first when I was looking around my house trying to find it, but then I figured out it's actually kind of perfect in that I feel like it gave way for more exploration of the symbolism of The Great Gatsby and Gen Z. So with that in mind, let's get into it. This is the official spoiler warning. If you have somehow not read The Great Gatsby, even though it was published literally 100 years ago, I would recommend you go read it, I guess. But also, I feel like if you haven't read The Great Gatsby now, I assume most people listening are grown-ups. So if you haven't read it now, were you ever going to? Probably not. Also, it's kind of wild if you haven't seen the movie either. I don't know. But anyway, official spoiler warning. I'm going to go through a lot of the symbolism of the book and a lot of the characters and a little bit of the plot as well. So again, leave now if you really want to read The Great Gatsby but don't want it spoiled. To kind of kick things off, instead of chatting about Gen Z, I thought I would chat a little bit about F. Scott Fitzgerald because he is endlessly more interesting to me. I think that he's probably arguably the most prominent voice of the jazz age, he brought a really specific type of critique to his work, which explored in detail the excess of the Roaring Twenties. He and his wife Zelda are these really interesting artists in that they lived in and were very much part of the culture. So their depictions of this time are really raw, and typically this word kind of bums me out and annoys me when people use it, but their descriptions are very raw and cerebral. Their work feels really real in a way that I think only living experiences can encapsulate. The Great Gatsby stands as arguably F. Scott Fitzgerald's most famous novel, which is why it is so often studied, I think, in high school. Its theme is startlingly simple and clear, as with most classics, most books, obviously, that we give to teenagers to read and pull the symbolism out of are going to be pretty simple to understand, but I don't think that makes it any less intriguing and interesting, which is why I love going back to classics and rereading them. But it had been a while since I reread The Great Gatsby, so that was a real treat. But to get into it, our main character, Mr. J. Gatsby, has everything that was cherished during the 20s. He is wealthy beyond your greatest imagination. He's young, he's handsome, the town is buzzing about him, everyone is gossiping, and he throws party after party in his big, expensive mansion. Externally, it feels like he wants for nothing. And yet, as the story unfolds, narrated by Nick, his poor, weird neighbor, we come to find that Gatsby is ultimately unsatisfied with his life. For Gatsby, the American dream, as told to him as a child, turns out to be impossible to hold. Even for a man with everything, it remains out of grasp. We are left for most of the book wondering, along with everyone else in his orbit, who Gatsby is, which, to kind of divulge my own book nerd vibes, I have to say is such a genius choice, and it makes the story really compelling and interesting to read. We don't even really hear Gatsby speak, I think, until like the third chapter. I might be wrong, going off of memory, but he's this really like aloof, elusive guy who we just know through Nick, the narrator, who happens to move next door to Gatsby. What is so interesting about the elusiveness of Jay Gatsby is that it feels like he's not participating in it while actively driving it. At least that's my read. You understand that he almost doesn't want to be known, but also is so desperate for connection through throwing these parties. So it's a really interesting tension that exists in the first little bit of the book that you don't really fully understand until later. Gatsby has sort of self-mythologized to a point beyond recognition. We come to find that this man made himself anew, that he single-handedly became a mirror of the American dream, and that he was not born into the privilege and society that we sort of find him in when the book begins. He lied, he cheated, but he did it, he made it, or so he thought, so he was told, so he sort of expected. I personally do gravitate towards Jay Gatsby, which is kind of alarming to say directly after introducing him as the king of Delulu and also yearning. But Gatsby reminds me of the ways that I made myself really consumable in order to build up social platforms when I was younger. I was really fortunate in my late teens and early 20s to have a couple of relatively big social accounts. I don't know how else to describe it. I got so close to that dream of Gen Z influence and creator and sort of prestige on the internet. And it's interesting to note how my peers react to this information today when I sort of drop that lore on them, or how they reacted when I pulled the plug and kind of retired back a few years ago. It keeps the line, in my opinion, between professional and personal Aves very clean and very clear. And to be completely honest with you, I don't feel a need, now that I've been mostly off social media, except for professional purposes, I don't feel the need to like be exposed to all of these makeup routines and hauls and faux think pieces that were probably written by ChatGPT. Once I got out of having my own personal social media accounts, it really changed the way that I think about culture and also the way that I think about my own generation, which I think is really interesting. So I was thinking a lot about my own former internet notoriety and of Jay Gatsby's failed attempt to fully realize the American dream when I got the idea to merge these two things for this episode. And I was particularly thinking about the symbolism of the green light and how we go about posting online in the hopes that someone will see it and connect with it and therefore connect with us. It feels so silly and goofy, but also scary and also comforting that over 100 years apart, we are still the exact same human beings as we were then. Like we've made no progress, but also we've made a tremendous amount of progress. When I look around at my friends, at like other people my age, there's this never-ending, impossible to satiate need to be seen. And not just to be seen, but also celebrated to, and this is a very easy word to use, but to have influence over people that we don't know. The advice is always like, just post that video, who knows what will happen. But then it's like, actually, that's not enough. You need to post 5 to 7 times a day. Diversify. Actually, no, find a niche, make the same type of content over and over again. Be cringe, don't be cringe, build an audience. No, actually, drive engagement, rage bait, no, community, connection over influence. But don't be authentic or you won't be able to engage. Don't be controversial, but provide fresh new takes, participate in trends, but stop the scroll. The tension cannot help but to be noted, I think, in Gen Z around how to show up online or just how to show up as people. The goal is notoriety, relevance, money, love, understanding, empathy, and none of it makes any sense. And it's all sort of bubbling over all the time for Gen Z. So, yes, it's exactly the same as it was back when The Great Gatsby was published. Now it's a little bit more boring and sanitized because all of this happens on our phones instead of in real life. But still, I think worth digging in. As Jay Gatsby himself says in the book, can't repeat the past. Why, of course you can. If you are a part of Gen Z and you're listening to this episode, I really hate to break it to you, but you are probably not giving Gatsby. In fact, you are giving Nick, the non-titular narrator of The Great Gatsby. Nick observes. That's his thing. He is swept away. He is, in a way, very malleable to his environment and to those around him who have more, who are sort of closer to that standard of success. He's kind of a looky-loo, just staring into a world that is mostly foreign and at the beginning of the book, very unattainable for him. Technically speaking, if we're talking about who Gen Z is, other than comparing them to Nick from The Great Gatsby, Gen Z refers to folks who were born between the late 90s and about 2012. I like to think of Gen Z as these almost forced spectators of the golden era of the millennial internet, which we talked about a couple episodes ago, but they're also born users of technology. Gen Z perfectly encapsulates how Nick shows up in The Great Gatsby, in my opinion. Watching, lurking, and lonely. Nick is lonely. As Gatsby steps away, he notes, I was alone again in the unquiet darkness. At another point, he says, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others, young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moments of night and life. Nick is a young guy who's watching and lonely and not super fulfilled by that, which is very interesting in the way that he narrates the story because he's not overly open about how not fulfilled he is by those things, which I also think is a very interesting connection to how Gen Z tends to think about themselves. When Nick is not in the orbit of the main characters like Jay or his cousin Daisy, he's sort of almost dead to us as the readers. We don't get a lot of true insight into his life outside of the events that are being driven by people outside of himself. So for better or for worse, Gen Z observes. We watch so much that it has become an activity and not like being in the audience of a symphony or a concert, but watching and staring at people through our phones has become a true time suck. For sort of the first time ever, It's an actual, like, huge daily chunk of a lot of people's routine, which is really very interesting. Gen Z scrolls away for hours in the dark, looking through a single window, which gives us a view into more desirable lives that feel more worth living, constantly bombarded with unboxing videos and hauls and day in the life vlogs that replace the simple joys of living out our own days and deciding things for ourselves. And so, what is so bad about that to a marketer? A generation of digital natives who are constantly scrolling. As an advertiser, you would think that was a dream, right? It must present so many exciting opportunities that lay within this sort of commitment to being constant audience members. But when you spend your life as an observer, it sort of absolves you of judgment. Sure, that sort of cowardice, the fear of cringe that Gen Z has, of being perceived, I think it drives both spectator and influencer. But what it does not drive is culture. And culture creates consumerism in a lot of ways. Of course, culture is also responsible for all the nice things like art and debate and social progress. But the harsh reality is that capitalism, our need to consume, has become one of the most powerful drivers of creating culture. So, the problem with Gen Z and the way that we've built monuments to our need to observe is that because of this, we are too scared to actually want something for ourselves in fear of being judged for wanting the wrong thing. What I've observed, both being part of this generation and also advising brands who look to appeal to Gen Z, is that trend cycles move too quickly to secure a business around them. Millennials, for example, are so tremendously easy to market to that we have like colors and styles and brand tones that we associate with millennials. There's like overly earnest, relatable brands work so well with millennials, and they did when they were younger and they do now. Like we've got millennial pink, we've got the sage green, grayish. They have very specific trademarks in what they're shopping for and how they want to be sold to. But Gen Z is really different. What I find particularly interesting and eerily similar about most of Gen Z and Nick is the sort of perverse way in which both Gen Z and Nick gradually accept new and radical circumstances in their life. Nick is this like really average guy who, in my opinion, is kind of a loser, but he does go through quite a big change throughout the book in how he thinks and shows up in the world. And it reminds me how easy it is to coerce Gen Z. And also, it kind of reminds me of like magical realism in that you don't really know what's going on until you know. I think about how much content Gen Z sort of consumes and how it's actually next to impossible to really take in all of that content in through our conscious minds. So a lot of it gets lodged deep in the unconscious. And now you mix that sort of ever shrinking interest in critical thought, which has been driven by heavy AI usage. And it gets a little spooky to think about all of these people and opinions and things to buy being stuck in your unconscious and like I said, shrinking ability for critical thought. It's a really bad combination for, like I said, actually creating culture and creating brands around what Gen Z actually wants or needs in the marketplace. Speaking of things that are a little bit spooky, I'm going to use this as a jumping off point to get back into the universe of Gatsby and talk about The Eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. This is, for most, I think the most recognizable cover of The Great Gatsby. It's like blue with the two eyes that are really creepy. If you haven't read the book, again, really weird behavior, go and read it. But if you haven't, I'll give you a quick rundown on The Eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. So these eyes exist on a billboard that sits in Queens. I also think it's really cute that the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckleburg are part of an ad, and this podcast is in its purest form all about ads. So kind of a cute little tie in there. But yeah, like I said, the billboard sits in Queens among what is described as a very gray, sort of fraying landscape. The area is significant because it's a thoroughfare between East and West Egg, which is where our main characters live, and sort of Manhattan. Nick, watchful Nick, with his ever-weakening morality throughout the course of this book, describes this area as a valley of ashes. He calls it, quote, grotesque and, quote, desolate. But it's an important area to the plot as it's where the main conflict really unfolds, where the big whoopsie-daisy takes place. That's a really funny joke if you have read the book or seen the movie. But the eyes, a lot of the times through the characters, are equated to a higher judgment. Nick presents them to us, the readers, as disembodied, creepy. He's really uneasy around them. Most characters, when they note the billboard, are seemingly sort of cowering under these eyes. Some would argue, and many have, that Dr. Eckleburg himself operates as a stand-in for a higher power, like a lot of the characters, specifically one Mr. Wilson sort of alludes to. They paint him as like a god of sorts who will right wrongs and keeps an eye over everything. But for me, these eyes have always been the strict and ever-present sort of glow of capitalism on society. The eyes exist as part of a larger billboard. Like I said, it's an ad. It's literally an ad. An ad that sits, I think, really interestingly in Queens, where most of the industry happened at the time. So the labor that makes the men in the story, the sort of main character men, wealthy, sort of happens in Queens. And everyone who lives in this area at this time, they're in this like constant state of surveillance of Dr. Eckleburg and his creepy eyes, but they're also constantly, I think, working closer and closer to get to that American dream that Gatsby is chasing himself. So again, when you kind of present the area at the time, it's a lot of people working very hard to try to get themselves out of poverty and get themselves, like I said, inch by inch closer to that American dream that has been told to them as it was told to Gatsby. It's really interesting to compare this to modern times and how ads work, and to compare it to the way that we now pay to avoid ads. Like, the wealthier you are, technically, the more easily you can avoid outside influence and advertisers. Because there isn't a big scary billboard surveying the world by Gatsby's mansion, it's worth arguing that they're not feeling the same pressure to conform to morality. They're doing whatever they want. It's the non-YouTube premium. It's like ads sliding into your DMs, waking up every morning and looking at that billboard. So again, this is something that I should almost delight in as an advertiser, but I do fear it represents the challenges of relating and selling to Gen Z. What's always been really particularly funny to me about the eyes of Dr. Eckleburg is the way that Nick truly recoils from them, and he feels so creeped out by them. And the lack of awareness and his inability to sort of differentiate his own ever-watching eyes from those of the billboard, I find very interesting, and a very interesting glimpse into who Nick is as a character. You know, we're looking at these big eyes on a billboard. It's like they're creepy, always watching everything, but he's always watching everything too, and he doesn't really seem to have a problem with that. So, interesting note that he feels so comfortable passing judgment on to others, but doesn't really own up to that. Again, I think is a really beautiful and very similar example of Gen Z behavior. I feel like actually beautiful was not the right word there, but it's interesting. It's beautiful that it was written 100 years ago and it's coming up now, but it does actually drive me nuts the way that Nick describes the eyes, in the same way that the sort of hypocrisy of Gen Z drives me nuts. I think that without a moral compass, we tend to lose our convictions and we lose our opinions, and we lose, in a way, our ability to really hope for the future. Okay, bouncing around again, I want to spend a little bit of time here discussing the green light in Gatsby himself. The green light is a really sort of prominent piece of symbolism in the novel, and also I think just like in literature at large. It's a very easy symbol to break down. But for those unfamiliar, Gatsby basically buys this big mansion and he throws parties and installs a bright green light at the end of his dock, all in the hopes of winning over a lost love Daisy. She lives with her old money and also super racist husband across the water from Gatsby, and his hope is to sort of lure her over to one of his near constant parties so that they might reunite. It's actually, well, incredibly delulu and full of yearning, a really good plan, in my opinion. It should have worked. It doesn't. Nick sort of sets them up, but it's a really solid plan. And again, maybe that's the Gatsby in me jumping out, but I would definitely do something like that if I had the resources. My favorite quote about the green light is, "It had seemed as close as a star to the moon." This comes from a paragraph in which Nick is describing watching Gatsby observe the light after he has had a successful reunion with Daisy that wasn't driven by the light. In that moment, it goes from a symbol of Gatsby's love for Daisy and his true hope for the future and their happiness into just another installment of his self mythology. It's simply a green light on a dock. And I think in particular moments of the novel, Gatsby really sort of grasps that it doesn't mean anything anymore now that Daisy knows that he's here. It's rendered almost useless. I think, in my humble opinion, this is a really great piece of symbolism for how Gen Z observes trends and why maybe we move from trend to trend so quickly. I reference this a lot in the millennial episode, but like the latest lip treatment that everyone's buying, or I think of sneakers that sell out really quickly over one summer and then nobody wants to wear them again. I think of the value of those items not from like a COGS point of view, but rather the value and the mythology attached to them by Gen Z. What is a Labubu if not another green light? Do you know what I mean? Gen Z buys these things, these items, these physical things in hopes of fostering some dream state of connection and belonging. But I believe that we're sort of so burnt out that we don't actually fully realize what's going on. And we also can't see the Gatsby green light of the whole thing. I think specifically of Gen Zers who are looking to buy one of those LL Bean tote bags, and they go on the internet and ask strangers to come up with a funny phrase for them to put on their own monogrammed bags. It is like unbelievable behavior to me, but I think it's another really perfect example and perfect comparison to the green light. They want a bag that is witty and charming and is going to pull someone in, get them the attention that they desire. But the reality is that whatever is on that bag, that little riff on their name or little pun about one of their interests, is just a really shallow ploy that will, once it sort of does what it is supposed to do and facilitates that conversation or that attention, will be rendered pretty useless because it's not something that they care about or find exciting. It's just another green light on the dock. The truth is, like almost every character in The Great Gatsby, Gen Z understands that to reach the American dream, they need to take as much from as many people as possible without getting caught. The eyes of Dr. Eckleburg do not scare them like they did Nick. Instead, I find Gen Z sort of embodies and they feel emboldened by this chokehold of capitalism and oftentimes easily sort of hide behind different accusations of inauthenticity to cover up a lack of individuality that really exists below the surface. This like preconceived notion of authenticity lying in your ability to purchase product is so totally wingnutty that I have decided as soon as I'm done filming this, I'm gonna go touch grass and look at the ocean to kind of cleanse myself of this subject matter and thought. But it is the reality of my generation, and I think it's very worth talking about. Because similar to the 1920s, we measure success in a very specific way through what is really tangible to us. And I think that boomers, certainly Gen X, and definitely a little bit millennials, they found different ways of equating their humanity to value and success. But Gen Z is so stuck in this mindset of literally 100 years ago. I think that for Gen Z, followers really create a sense of authority, and that sense of authority gives them permission to not abandon authenticity, but to be really emboldened in a faux authenticity. But I do think we must take the time to learn from Gatsby's mistake, which ultimately did cost him his life. He dies as Jay Gatsby, this mysterious rich guy plagued by a turbulent mind and unrelenting desire for something that he cannot have. But we find this out quite late in the novel, which again I think is a really wonderful choice by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Not that he needs my kudos, but we find out Jay Gatsby was actually born James, or kind of cute little nickname, Jimmy Gats. He was a really poor kid from North Dakota who loathed his station in society so entirely. From the jump, we can see that young Gatsby, or Gats, is willing to do anything to become anyone to change his circumstances. I think a lot of people who touch any kind of virality of internet presence or influence can probably relate to him if they're being really honest with themselves. And I do feel like most people who do reach some kind of virality or internet presence and influence don't really take time to think about themselves critically or honestly. That's a sweeping generalization, but I do think it's kind of true. Anyway, Jimmy Gats does not really acquire his wealth legally. Like I mentioned before, he does lie, he steals, he cheats, he commits crimes, and all of this is driven by an almost intrinsic desire in him to be rich. You can tell that for Jimmy Gats, wealth equates happiness, which is, again, a really interesting mirror to what's going on with Gen Z culture today. It's what really matters most to Gatsby as a character in those early days. It's what mattered culturally back when the book was written in the 20s, and it's what matters a lot now. Wanting and yearning become so much a part of who Jimmy Gats is that we can see as readers there's no end to it. Similar to what we were talking about last week with boomers, I think Gen Z suffers from this same endless want, which is why I actually did place these episodes back to back to kind of call out those similarities. I find both sort of generations, boomers and Gen Z, clumsily grab out in the market and in the world around them to look for something they can hold and then they can kind of fill with this yearning and desire long enough to keep them comfortable before the next thing comes along. But inevitably, there is always something new. So it's sort of this hamster wheel of consumerism that is, again, really interesting when we're talking about marketing to Gen Z. I do believe that as Jimmy Gats sort of changed and morphed himself into this Jay Gatsby character, this, like I said, mirror of the American dream, I think that he slowly lost his actual ability to hope for the future. Drowned in excess, I think that Jay Gatsby lost access to himself and his own ability to feel anything other than that yearning, that want, and desire. He didn't really have anything else guiding him, which, similar to Nick, this lack of morality really defined that era, and I think really defines the decade that we're in now, as well as Gen Z. I think I mentioned this earlier, but when I first conceptualized this episode, I was thinking solely about the similarities between posting online and the symbolism of the green light. Just sort of putting something out there and hoping to attract someone specific and to gain connection and love from that. But what I uncovered as I reread The Great Gatsby and then subsequently lost my copy of The Great Gatsby was an even greater comparison and thesis for this episode. Gen Z, like both Nick and Gatsby, are incredibly malleable and willing to do whatever it takes to embody how success is defined today, which is very materialistic. I think that Gen Z has become both predator and prey to their own obsession with watching, their own obsession with having an audience. I think that it's all gotten very mixed up and very confusing, which makes it very difficult to communicate with them on a large scale level, such as marketing. So, who wins in all of this? If you've made it this long into the episode, I'm gonna guess that you actually have read The Great Gatsby and you're a big fan. Or maybe you are my boyfriend who hates The Great Gatsby and the Roaring Twenties, but loves me, so listen anyway. But a quick and very short-changed summary of the entire plot of The Great Gatsby is that Gatsby, this eccentric rich guy who lied about himself, he throws parties for the girl of his dreams, Daisy, but he eventually dies unfulfilled. He actually dies in a murder-suicide after taking responsibility for, this is where things get very complicated, which is why I didn't really talk about the full plot, but he dies in a murder-suicide after taking responsibility for the death of Daisy's husband's mistress. Wild, confusing. I know there's this whole business that I don't really care for at the end where they're like switching cars. I understand why it has to happen. It's just really unrealistic to me in any decade that you're like switching cars. It's a really like weird kind of plot driver. Anyway, they're all switching cars. Daisy ends up driving like her husband's car and hits Mrs. Wilson, who mistakes Daisy and Gatsby for Tom, Daisy's husband, who is sleeping with Mrs. Wilson. Like, I cannot express enough how weird and convoluted the end of this book is. It's great. Again, read it. But it gets a little tricky at that period. It's a little weird. But it's actually Mr. Wilson, her husband, who goes quite mad at the end of the book. Mr. Wilson, interestingly enough, is the sort of number one believer, and he alludes often to the eyes of Dr. Eckleburg as some sort of god and equalizer who's going to bring justice to these people that he sees as taking a lot from him personally and his community. What's so interesting about that is that you and I both know that Dr. Eckleburg is just an ad. It's just eyeballs in an ad that has faded away. So what's so poetic to me about this ending is that Tom, who I haven't really discussed, Daisy's husband, other than being racist and a cheater, Tom is ultimately the winner of the story, which I think is so predictable and yet profound. Tom comes from old money. He's a station befitting of Daisy's love. He steals the affection of both Mr. Wilson's wife and also Mr. Gatz or Gatsby's beloved sort of lifelong crush. Kind of a situationship, if we're being honest. But I'll let you read the book and decide if you haven't. And if you have read the book, let me know what you think about all of it, but also Daisy and Gatsby. Anyway, what I do love is Tom is undoubtedly the winner, which is so bleak, but so realistic. And so, to sort of start back at the top, we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past turns out to also be a banger conclusion to this episode, because 100 years later, one of the greatest explorations of Gen Z, I believe, is a novel written to describe the impossibility of the American dream throughout the Roaring Twenties, which is exactly what's going on today. We love a fortune teller in F. Scott Fitzgerald. We love his prophecies. Not jazzed about them, that's a good pun, but not jazzed about them being super true, but so cool and interesting that, yeah, 100 years apart, you can really see the similarities between that story and what's happening now and how Gen Z shows up in the world. I feel like this episode turned out to be a lot grimmer than I maybe imagined and less like technically applicable than others in this run of talking about generations and breaking them down. But I do really think it was worth discussing all of this and worth digging in and also worth rereading The Great Gatsby, even if inevitably I lost the book, blah, blah, blah. Because I've seen so many failed Gen Z specific brands who look to market authenticity, they look to market their sustainable practices, and I've seen these brands falter and fall from a lack of interest from Gen Z. I feel like I could honestly yap about The Great Gatsby for like 12 more hours, but I won't. I just think the biggest takeaway here should be that Gen Z is a lot more brutal than you might be anticipating, and authenticity is often just a ruse for conformity in Gen Z culture, especially in online spaces. I think the appearance of authenticity is actually worth more to Gen Z than true individuality, which is actually very grim. So it makes sense that the episode turned out to be a little bit grim. I think that all of us should really consider what that means if we are looking to build brands around Gen Z, and that they aren't as loyal as, like I mentioned, millennials. Really great example of loving brands for who the brand is. But Gen Z, the real way to get to them, to us, me included, is to produce something that they want. And so it's not so much a matter in this case of being able to communicate your product effectively, which is what we talked about in basically all of the other episodes around this topic. With Gen Z, and I have seen this firsthand, the true trick to success is really tapping into your cogs, your product design, and figuring out how you can get products to market quicker than anybody else. One thing you should have picked up on in this episode is that I talked a lot about trend cycles and how quickly they move. Gen Z moves quickly. They want low-waisted pants this summer, myself included. I'm saying they, me, want low-waisted pants this summer, and who knows what's going to happen next summer. I think that so much of your success as a brand catering to Gen Z is going to be around how you can fit into their digital spheres and how you can manage to keep up with these really rapidly changing trend cycles. I do feel a little bit excited to tap into my inner Nick for the rest of my life and continue observing my peers, myself, what makes brands stick to Gen Z and why they like them. I think that it's really exciting to see the possibility of some brands coming up who won't be tied so directly to trend cycles, but maybe just speak to something really core within Gen Z. I don't think we've really seen that yet. So excited to, like I said, keep my little Nick hat on sometimes and keep watching, keep observing. And that is basically it. The two takeaways are: look at your cogs and your product design if you want to start focusing on a Gen Z audience. And also, more importantly than that, if you haven't read The Great Gatsby, you should do it immediately. It's not a very long book, but it's really good. Also, watch the movie. It's so good. It's got that Lana Del Rey song. You'll love it. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode as much as I enjoyed rereading The Great Gatsby and putting these notes together and researching some of the trends that we see in Gen Z consumer behavior. If you did enjoy it, please drop a comment. Like I said, I would love to know your thoughts on The Great Gatsby as a novel. Any weird opinions you have on it or not weird opinions, let me know. I love talking about The Great Gatsby, obviously, or any book. And make sure to give us a subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast, whether that's Spotify, Apple Music, you do you, just enjoy. But make sure to give us a subscribe, and I will chat to you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening.